Good evening and welcome to everybody to this talking about socialism from a Marxist point of view. My name is Will McMahon. I'm the facilitator of this meeting. It's nice to see everybody here. The far right riots, what do we make of them? I mean, actually, I think using the word riot is to prettify them, really. I think we're looking at pogroms, thuggery, and lynch mobs is what we're really looking at. Um, so there's a lot to discuss about this. It's very dramatic events. And what we do talking about socialism is we give the introductory speaker this evening, who's Nick Wrack, we give him 15 minutes to introduce, which is very tight. So I'll be bringing Nick in during the conversation as it goes along. And then we ask people to take 3 minutes. And we are pretty strict about this. And the reason we're strict about it is because it gives everybody at least one or two or sometimes three opportunities to speak and to make an intervention of some sort. We will finish at 9 p.m. on the dot, and hopefully nobody will say anything litigious because this is going out live. And also, if you're worried about your presence in your workplace or your union activities, then you obviously keep your camera off if you wish to. So I'm not gonna waste any time. With further ado, I'm gonna invite Nick to speak for 15 minutes on the far right riots and socialist politics around them. Nick.
Thanks very much, Will. Thank you, everybody, for coming and joining the meeting. I'm going to start in a minute, but I just wanted to say, take up a minute, actually. First of all, apologising for the curtains. I'm staying in a hotel in Worcester, which is not a place I've spent much time. I think the last time I was here was about 20 years ago. But there's a plaque outside my hotel, on the wall of the hotel, and it commemorates the Battle of Worcester on the 3rd of September, so tomorrow, in 1651. And it was the final determinative battle of the English Civil War. Charles I had been executed on the 30th of January of 1649, and his son, who was later to become Charles II, tried to rally forces to overthrow Cromwell and the Commonwealth, and they met here in what was then royalist Worcester, and Oliver Cromwell's new model army smashed the later to be Charles II and the 14,000 Scots that were in his army. So it's actually a very decisive battle in English history. And interestingly, 100 years or so later, in 1786, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who were the second and third presidents of the USA, were on an 8-day holiday in England, touring gardens and English Civil War sites. And John Adams said, "Do Englishmen so soon forget the ground where liberty was fought for? All England should come in pilgrimage to this hill once a year." He was referring to Fort Royal Hill, where the royalists lost. And I say that because I think it's interesting, because the English Civil War, the English bourgeois revolution, is something that's often forgotten. And the fact that we did actually execute a king a long time ago, you know, forward to a republic, a socialist republic in the future. But moving to the question of the riots, first of all, there's a lot to say in this, and there'll be difference of emphases. And I just want to stress that I'm going to try to be nuanced in what I say, but it can be quite difficult how to characterize the events and the forces involved. And I think most people are pretty familiar with the events themselves, but it's worth rehearsing how the events unfolded. I'm glad that Will made the point about riots, because in the article that I posted soon after the riots began, I did use all three of those words: pogroms, thuggery, lynch mobs, and that's exactly what they were. And I don't want to prettify them at all, because they were shocking. It's also important when we look at this to try to assess, what did they signify? So, for example, what are the forces of the far right? What does the far right mean? Is there a difference between fascism and far right politics or far-right organizations. What is fascism? And I think we need to be careful about how we use that, because there is a tendency. I just wonder if people could mute themselves. There is a tendency amongst the left, or some of the left, to use fascist or fascism as a term of abuse to denigrate or characterize any figure on the right, whereas I take the view that it's a specific force in society that arises at certain times with specific aims. So that's not to say there aren't individual fascists or groups of fascists that circulate in society, but whether they have the power to act on their ideas is something that perhaps people will come in on. One of the things that I am going to say is that these riots or these pogroms, and they were pogroms, it's fortunate that nobody was killed in the course of them, but these pogroms did not come out of thin air. It's not that suddenly one day we woke up and these fascists, these racists were on the street. There's been a process bubbling under the surface, and perhaps we saw a glimpse of that bubbling in the so-called patriotic rally that Tommy Robinson organized in the summer of this year, I think in July, in London, where there was a gathering of his supporters, EDL forces, and so on. But just remind ourselves of what happened on that led up to these. On Monday, the 29th of July, 3 young girls were stabbed to death while attending a Taylor Swift themed dance class in Southport on the northwest coast of Lancashire in the United Kingdom, not far from Manchester, where I am now living. A young boy, Axel Rudukubana, who was 17 at the time, has been arrested and charged with the murders of those 3 girls and another 10 charges of attempted murder and with the possession of a bladed article, a knife, which he used to carry out those horrible attacks. You'll all know that his name, revealing his name, was prohibited because he was not yet 18, but that a judge at Liverpool Crown Court lifted that prohibition on naming him publicly. And the reason given was because there was a wave of misinformation spreading about the culprit, which had been used as an excuse, and it was an excuse, not justified at all, but it was an excuse, and it was used to justify the widespread eruption of violence that ensued, starting essentially with an attack on a mosque in Southport itself, which then spread elsewhere. Again, I don't follow social media that closely. I know other people on this talk follow it much more closely than I do. But it's clear that false rumors circulated on various different social media platforms. And for example, there was one account, it's a website called Europe Invasion. It circulates Islamophobic and anti-immigrant content. It claimed that the suspect, quote, was alleged to be a Muslim immigrant. Within days, that post had been viewed more than 6 million times. Another website called Channel 3 News has a track record of spreading misinformation. It claimed that the name of the culprit, the name of the suspect, was Ali al-Shakati, clearly a Muslim name, and that he was on an MI6 Secret Service security watch list. We, of course, know that none of that information was correct. It also claimed that he'd crossed the English Channel in a small boat. Small boat or small boats is a theme that features in the political discussion on immigration. It's used repeatedly by all politicians, saying we're going to do something about the small boats. We've got to stop the small boats. The small boats are the problem. Then they say we've got to stop the gangs, as if it's the gangs rather than the causes of the reasons for people fleeing: persecution, war, poverty, disease, oppression. It's now known that the suspect who's been arrested, Axel, the 17-year-old boy, now 18, is in fact a British citizen. He was born in Cardiff to Rwandan parents. His family had moved to the Southport area and were living in a nearby place called Banks in Lancashire, and he's attended the local Formby Range High School. It's said in all the reports that I've seen, which seem genuine, that he comes from a family that attends a Christian church. So nothing in the rumours about him being a Muslim, about him being an immigrant, about his name, about anything was correct. But it was used really as a rallying cry by the racists, the anti-immigrant right, fascists, all of whom, or most of whom, perhaps I should say, were clearly organized and brought out and directed by channels used by the fascists and the far right, like Telegram and other private channels, calling people out to demonstrate and insidiously, controversially, disgracefully saying, save the kids, save the kids. Of course, their rallies were nothing to do with saving the kids. It was all about pursuing their anti-immigration, racist, nationalist agenda. Nigel Farage, the leader of the far-right Reform Party, newly elected as the MP for Clacton, posted a video late on Monday, the 29th of July, so that's within hours of the horrific stabbing, suggesting that information about the suspect was being withheld. And he speculated about whether the stabbing suspect was being monitored by the security services. So he was echoing those far-right Islamophobic websites and tweets. He was deliberately fueling the Islamophobic conspiracy theories that were already circulating. He was challenged, I think it was on LBC, about the sharing of misinformation. And he tried to justify it by saying he'd got the information from Andrew Tate. Well, I think some of you, if not all of you, will know that Andrew Tate is the notorious self-described misogynist. He sees that as something to boast about. He's a far-right social media presence, and he's currently under house arrest, I think it is, in Romania on charges of multiple rape and human trafficking for sexual exploitation. Why Nigel Farage would want to share or repeat anything that originated from that source is perhaps easily answered. Telegram and other social messaging platforms I've already mentioned, including by the fascist, and I call him a fascist, Tommy Robinson, a former member of the fascist British National Party, the BNP, and leader of the fascist English Defence League, the EDL, now dissolved, although clearly members of the EDL or former members of the EDL are clearly in contact with one another and are organized and are talking to one another in their own private channels. They called for protests. Of course, they were not protests at all. They were not protesting against anything except immigration and Muslims. They were not protests. They were political rallies of the racist and fascist dregs of society. So another thing that some commentators, and I think, I'm not sure whether Starmer himself has used this expression, but some commentators have described it as mindless thuggery. of course, it's not mindless at all. It is conscious political thuggery by fascists, semi-fascists, racists, fueled by their hatred of Muslims and their shared xenophobia, and no doubt that reinforced by the fuel of alcohol, as we saw. So these racist, fascist lynch mobs spewed out their racist filth against refugees, asylum seekers, mosques, Asians and black people, anyone who looked as though they might be Muslim or people of color. Some, if not all of you, I can't see that, Will. What's 5 minutes to go? Oh my goodness. Okay. People will have seen, you all will have seen some of the videos. Piccadilly Gardens in Manchester or nearby, where a black man was attacked and viciously kicked, stamped on. Somebody's just recently been imprisoned for participating in that. No doubt had children, the protection of children firmly in his mind. It was revealed when he was sentenced that he had, let me just check that I get this right. Yes. The man that I'm referring to, he shouted, "Kill him, stamp on his face." When they searched his house, he had Nazi propaganda, swastikas, and he had 31 offences for sex offences against children under the age of 13. To show the fascist content of some of these tweets, we had, today it was in the news, the wife of a Tory councillor tweeted a call for asylum seekers' hotels to be set on fire. And she tweeted, "If that makes me a racist, so be it." I think it's clear that the nature of these events was clearly racist, Islamophobic, fascist in content. I don't discount the possibility at all that some of the people that were involved might have been caught up for less insidious reasons, perhaps less racist, perhaps not fascist, perhaps even for some of the younger people just caught up in the moment. But the overwhelming character of these events was as I describe it. Having said that, it's important to again, people can come back at me if I say something you disagree with. What do these events mark? Well, I think that they mark a flexing of muscles by organized fascists and racists to see what they could mobilize, to see what they could do. It was an attempt to destabilize, to worry the state and the police, and to get out on the street and to see whether they could create fear and panic in the minds of Muslims and other people of color. But at the same time, I've not been able to see any total figures for the numbers involved, but I would imagine that they can't have been more than a few thousand. However, behind that, and one of the things that perhaps we've got to do more analysis on and understand, is that this development and this outbreak is a reflection of this process that's been going on, which is reflected. And again, I don't characterize everybody that's voted this way in the same way. There are clearly differentiations to be made, but the rise in the vote for the Brexit Party, for UKIP, and now for Reform, particularly with Reform now winning MPs, these are significant developments that we, as the socialist left, have to take into consideration. But also, it wasn't just the far right that bear responsibility, or right-wing Tory politicians that bear responsibility for the political climate in which anti-immigration, xenophobic ideas have become almost legitimized, as if there is something legitimate about blaming immigration. I've got no doubt that some people do worry about immigration and they worry about the allocation of resources. But we know that immigrants are not responsible for the crisis that we have in the NHS, in housing, in the provision of social services. In fact, large sections of our economy and the services in this country depend upon immigrants. And we, as the socialist left, have an obligation and a duty to answer those ideas and those arguments. And until we have a clear socialist party that is prepared to do that day in, day out, then these arguments that spew out from the right and from the Starmer wing of the Labour Party will go unanswered or go, they will not be completely answered. Keir Starmer may have curtailed or stopped the deportation of asylum seekers by airplanes to Rwanda, but he's still stopping immigration and clamping down on the small boats a centerpiece of his economic and social political program. So it's still there. And I would argue that by doing that, he actually gives legitimacy to people that use it as an excuse to come out and carry out their far-right thuggery. Will, I'm not sure how much longer I've got, just 1 minute. Okay. I'm going to jump and just throw a few ideas out, which hopefully people will come back on. At the same time as we're seeing these processes here and trying to work out a proper assessment, it's important that we don't exaggerate, but it's also important that we don't underestimate. And it's very important that we don't take the attitude that it's only a small number of people and it doesn't really matter, because look at the response. And the response was magnificent. Ordinary working class people came out. They mobilized for the rallies that the far right had claimed were going to take place on the Wednesday. They didn't really materialize, but ordinary working class communities came out in their thousands and they showed their opposition to those rallies. There's been an interesting opinion poll for the Huffington Post, and it says that 52% of people that they polled, you always have to be careful because they're always small samples, but 52% of people, 54% of people polled blamed Tommy Robinson, 51% blamed Nigel Farage, 44% blamed Elon Musk, obviously the ex-billionaire who's used his privilege and power to stir the pot and back the racists. 40% blamed Keir Starmer. But it's interesting that just going on even on that small sample, that the majority of people can see who is immediately responsible. What we have to do is to also extend that and give explanations about how the whole political class, with its use of immigration and Islamophobia, creates the atmosphere or the ground in which these ideas can grow. Of course, it's also against decades of social degradation, the so-called left behind town.
Hey, Nick, I'm gonna have to.
That's it. Okay. Well, I'm going to stop there. Maybe I'll be able to finish some of my other points in the course of the discussion. Anyway,
I will bring you in. Thank you very much. Thanks for that. Can I? Who would like to? There's a lot to talk about. So come if you've got any questions, ask them. Brief contributions, ask them. 3 minutes, etc., etc. Okay, Matthew, you're in there. Go on.
Okay, right. I think to just say a few other things to add to what Nick has said, and thanks for the introduction. I think the point is this is an international movement, towards fascism, and it's also, of course, backed by substantial sections of the ruling class itself. So we're seeing, if you look at it, you can see a network of the far right and the fascists, actually organising conferences through Europe. Orban, Meloni, the National Rally in France, the whole lot. Obviously, then also connected to the Ukrainian fascists, who basically are the driving force of the Ukrainian government, and of course Israel. Because of course, to be a fascist these days, mostly, and certainly, the largest section of fascists these days are Zionists as well. There are small sections of fascists who just hate all Jews, but most fascists actually are quite happy to do deals with the Zionists, as in fact as the Nazis were as well. But it's that international movement. So what it means is that the likes of Robinson, aka also his real name, Stephen Yaxley Lennon, has a large amount of money. He's given money particularly actually by the Zionists. So he has a very large income. He can then go on. Again, I mean, Farage actually has the biggest income of any MP in Parliament because he's given all this money by various sources and so on, including, of course, very strong connections to Trump. So he makes £1 million a year at the moment. So all these things are very, there's a whole that money swirling around because obviously this stuff is now being officially moved. If you look at, I mean, one of the things that actually it is a key factor also, of course, is the rise of reform. Now, I mean, if you look at reform in the election, I mean, what you're seeing obviously is first of all a split from the Tory party to the right, which is what allowed Starmer in. I mean, on the lowest vote of any incoming government since universal suffrage, it's the split to reform. Now, the thing is, of course, reform, of course, is a company. It's not. I mean, what we're seeing now is, of course, the origin of political parties not being based on any kind of, holding membership or democracy or any of this kind of stuff. It's actually based on, you own it. So Farage is the chief shareholder of Reform. However, Reform, of course, doesn't have much of an infrastructure, or didn't have until the election. So, in fact, of course, they stood candidates around the country, many of whom don't exist.
Matthew,
they stood those candidates. They stood using offices and agents and so on. So which are notional. I mean, my constituency here in Glasgow, the address given by Reform is the hardware store up the road here, and the candidate, as far as we know, doesn't exist.
Okay.
But
stop you there,
this person got 3 times as many votes as the damn Tories. I mean, this is what we're facing. Anyway, yeah. I'll come back and have another go.
You can come back. You can come back, Matthew. Sorry to. We just like to keep it flowing. Yeah, Janet.
Yeah, I'm coincidentally really just picking up a few points that Matthew made, and I did make some notes, and I'm afraid it went on to 4 minutes. So I'll try and speak quickly. I don't know. It's a slightly not quite on. It is on the subject, but it's a very specific thing, and it's about a debate that is going on, I think, in parts of the left at the moment, primarily between David Miller and people who support him and some of the Jewish socialist groups, JVL and so on, about the causes of the riots. I think it's interesting because it also raises wider issues that perhaps are not for tonight. I don't know. But Miller has said in several interviews and articles that the riots were instigated by Israel, by Zionists, through Tommy Robinson. And when he says instigated, he doesn't mean he was part of the context, part of the causes, but actually triggered the riots personally, and that he's an Israel asset. I don't know if he is or not. At one point, Miller talks about him pressing the button. And then he makes points, and so did Loki and lots of people, and Matthew's right about the links between Robinson and Zionism and Israel, going back, 20, 30, 20 years, possibly not quite that long, around links between him and neocons and so on. And he's been funded from 2010, something like that, and that was part of the founding of the EDL. And all of that is very well evidenced. And there has clearly been a shift from, in parts, the majority of the far right in the UK, from a sort of general anti-immigration, anti-Semitism into Islamophobia. However, although I agree with most of what he's saying about that, it seems to me his conclusions are, do I think fatuous? I think they're wrong. And I think when he's asked, why would Zionists trigger these particular riots at this time, he comes up with something which is, it seems to me, extremely weak. He says, because Israel objecting, or have objected, I'm sure they have, to Starmer's withdrawing the government's objection to the ICC judgment. He says they're worried, concerned, or angry about a possible arms embargo, and we saw today a tiny bit of that, and that they want to punish Muslims here for their pro-Palestinian stance. Which all of those seem to me to be actually, I don't know what the word is, but they seem to me a very weak arguments. Now, clearly there's massive influence on US politicians particularly, and on foreign policy here, and by Israel Zionism. I'm certainly not underplaying that. So does that any of that matter? Okay. I think it does, because it reflects to an extent Miller's view on the predominance of Zionism in all of these issues over the role of the US, of the hegemony, the role of Europe, and so on, in a way that I think is distorted.
I'm going to have to stop you there.
Right, there were three other reasons, but
come back. Do come back. Yeah, do come back. Steve.
Cool.
Steve.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think 3 points I'd just like to make. I think the first one is, I know we've discussed this in the past. I've missed a few meetings in the summer. I was overwhelmed with Keir Starmer's election victory and took 2 months off. But anyway, I think first point I think to make is what Nick touched upon. I think we have to draw back from any sort of alarmist, any sort of panic talk here, right? Because you turn on Netflix, you turn on Amazon, you turn on any show, you're going to get a program about the Nazis. We're flooded with shows about the Nazis, so we need to ensure that we don't panic here and start labeling this as a resurgence of what we saw in the 1930s. I'm not saying it doesn't have the potential; it certainly does. But at this stage, we have to understand, I think, what actually, what fascism itself was. Fascism was a bulwark against social revolution. And unfortunately for all of us, sadly, we're not at that stage. We don't require, the ruling class do not require a bulwark, last resort, to save their system against the socialist revolution. The left in itself, the trade union movement, is quite comfortable alongside this Starmer government, alongside many governments in Europe, and that brings me to my second point. This is, yesterday we saw. If you want to, for the election result for the ADF in Germany. Now this does have a parallel with us. I don't have these figures, but the figures for the vote in East Germany is that 38% of those who voted for the ADF were between the age of 18 and 24 years of age, right? Even in Saxony, it's 34% who did the same. So, and then I think what we need to understand is where is this support coming from? Where will this support keep coming from? And if that vote in Germany yesterday indicates that it's coming potentially from an angry layer of youth that have really been given no hope by the Tories for 14 years, what style we're offering them, what direction will they go in. So that's really, I think, what we need to think about is I take Janet's points on board. They're very interesting, but I think perhaps I'm not saying they're not relevant, and they're very relevant. But I think we need to concentrate a little bit on the social causes of what's fueling this, and I think the fueling of it is actually potentially similar to what fueled the young guys to head towards the Nazis and the Mussolini. And I think that's the worrying aspect to this, because we as ourselves, I mean, many on this group was in the YS, for example. You don't have to have been in the YS, but we were. It was a certain pole of attraction. Sure, other comrades had been in other poles of attraction. But there really doesn't appear to me to be a pole of attraction for young people. And as you say, you're throwing in Andrew Tate, you're throwing in Farage. These are sadly, quite appealing characters. And
I'm gonna stop you there, Steve.
Tommy Robinson. Yeah, just one final sentence, and I
Yep.
think that's what we really need to take into account. I might come back, unusual for me, but thank you.
Oh, but do come back, yeah. John Fitzgerald.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Nick. Yeah, lots to say in a very short time. 3 minutes.
Well, pick one or two things, and you can come back later.
Yeah, I think I'm. There's been so much said about this, and previous speakers have highlighted a lot of different, aspects of it. And I think that it's interesting, I think, in as much as that the big demonstration he had on the 27th of July, what appears to have kicked all this off. I mean, previously there was some events around the fact that two-tier policing had been an issue. And then he had this big demonstration in London. I think there was around 30,000 maybe. And he showed a video. This is Tommy Robinson. He showed a video which the courts had already told him that if he showed this video, he would be done for something or another. I forget all the legal words. So the next day, instead of he knew he was going to be arrested, and instead of turning up in court, he done a bun. He got to the border, and they tried to stop him. But apparently, they took him to the police station, but they couldn't actually do him on anything, so they let him go. And so then he goes abroad, stays in this hotel, and starts making posts, as to what it's about. And he's saying that I'm calling for protest, but I'm not calling, for this violence and so on. We shouldn't be, hitting our public servants, our policemen, our firemen, and so on. So he's playing the game. He's playing the game, and of course he's also putting videos out at the same time. But we have to, he's very, as you say, like with Trump and Farage. I think he was trying to build up some kind of alliance with Reform. I think he still intends doing that if they can. And I also, he will actually, apparently that the judge there is a warrant out for his arrest.
John, I'm going to have
sorry.
to stop there.
I'll just finish. there
Yeah.
was a warrant out for his arrest, and the warrant wasn't issued because he was abroad and they were going to give him a chance to get back. But apparently, when he gets back, he will be arrested and taken to court because he showed this video. I'll come back later on that.
Okay. All right, John. I've got to stop. I'm gonna have to stop you there, mate. Kate.
Have I unmuted myself?
Yes, you have.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, I kind of felt when this happened, I kind of felt like the real problem is a political vacuum, that there is nobody actually standing up for the working class, you know. And during the election, you know, I listened to a lot of the independents and what they had to say. And I was really struck by Fiona Lally, who's a young woman of colour who was standing for the Revolutionary Communist Party. I actually sent her some money. I was so impressed. And she had a programme that addressed the needs of the working class. You know, the people who feel really hopeless and left out. And it doesn't excuse any violence. You know, we can kind of understand it. It doesn't excuse trying to burn down hotels that asylum seekers are in. But that's what we need. And I think, you know, that's what Jeremy Corbyn tried to do. And obviously there were all sorts of criticisms of that within the Labour Party. And it failed. But I think what was used against it actually was a form of Islamophobia. It was these attacks on people who are standing up for Palestine. And I just feel like the whole society we're existing at the moment is increasingly authoritarian and hostile. And I feel that people at the bottom are kind of taking their cue from that as well. You know, they're pushed around. They see the politicians pushing people around. And so when someone induces them to, you know, to be violent, they're going to follow that call because there's nothing else. Myself, I felt personally very vulnerable. It's the first time I've really felt like that because I do support people in prison who are migrants facing deportation. I work with a couple of lawyers, but we don't have an office and I actually work from home. So that was quite lucky in a way. But I know the postmen know where the letters come to because they go to a post box and then the postman delivers to me. And I kept thinking, maybe there's a fascist amongst postmen. It was quite sort of paranoid. But it's actually the whole thing about the thing about what happened with Germany, you know, and when it actually starts to affect you. And of course, all of us are affected. And one of, you know, and I really hold the politicians in power very much responsible for this. And Suella Braverman, I remember her tactic of talking about lefty lawyers, and it's extending it, you know, it's extending it to all of us, really. I don't know if I'm making sense saying this. So that's how I feel. I feel it's all an instrument of the class system, really, and that's what we've got to address. And my clients who are right down at the bottom, some of them who've out of prison now, I mean, they're so scared. They're so scared about the whole stuff that's going on about immigrants. And, you know, I was scared for a day, but one of them couldn't go out for a week because he was so frightened. Anyway, I can't really think of anything else to say, but
thank you. Thanks for that. And I know that kind of thing about fear, because one of my work colleagues who she has a son who's mixed ethnicity, and she just didn't want him out of the house in Leeds at all. People were afraid of what might happen, and it's a real fear, and it's not paranoia, it's a real fear. That's, you know, but that's unfortunately what fascism tries to engender, is that fear, which is why the kind of show of solidarity I thought was brilliant in the week. I'm going to bring in Ed and then John Tuman and then Toby Absey. Ed.
Yeah, thanks, Will, and thanks to Nick for the introduction as well. I think I want really to just pick up on a point made by Steve about the significance of fascism and what it is and what it represents and how it relates to the position we're in now. Because I think broadly I agree with Steve that fascism is a particular historical phenomenon, and it's what happens when I think, as Steve put it, the ruling class turns to the fascists in order to defeat and beat down the social revolution. And it's right, I think, to observe that obviously we're not in a position of being able to carry forward the social revolution or even close to it. And so it flows from that of course, the capitalist class are not about to turn to the fascists and hand over power to them. But I think there's two caveats that I place on that. Maybe Steve would agree with them, maybe not. But I think they do have a bearing on what we do and how we respond. The first is that, of course, as and when it may become necessary for the ruling class to turn to fascism and to hand over power to it, it's not something that can simply be created overnight. It has to have a gestational period, meaning that fascist movements and parties have to be nurtured in the years leading up to such a development, or at least given tacit approval and room to grow, and kid gloves, and that kind of treatment. And so I think it's absolutely the case that at least some of the forces involved in various phenomena, whether they be the riots here or the growth of the AfD in Germany, which other people have referred to, certain elements within those are undoubtedly part of what could be a fascist force in a different situation down the line. And so I think we need to respond accordingly. But of course, how we do that, and this is the second caveat, is how we do that has got to be informed by all of the other elements in the mix. Because as I think other people have said, and I agree with, there are various forces and people and trends at play here, some of which, probably the majority of which, wouldn't see themselves as openly fascist, many of which perhaps even wouldn't see themselves as racist. And I think that has got to inform the next phase of our discussions after the initial response, where we, perhaps did a decent job of responding in the moment to the emergence of these riots and these outbursts. What's the next stage of our response? Well, the next stage is to work out how we come up with a convincing response that speaks to people who might get involved in demonstrations of this kind, or the Tommy Robinson support demonstrations, even while not seeing themselves as fascist or racist, or they might vote for the AfD or Front National in France while not seeing themselves as racist. And I think it's those people who we need to think really carefully about how do we intervene, how do we detach them from the more serious hard right and fascist forces that are clearly steering things. So I think that's my those are sort of my caveats as to how we analyse these forces and categorise them.
Thanks very much, Ed. I think really important points made there. And maybe we want to pick up on them later. But first, I want to go to John Tuman.
Thanks very much. It's pronounced Tuman, actually.
Tuman.
It's all right.
Sorry, I'll try and remember.
Yeah, I will. Yeah. I very much agree with what Ed said there, and what Steve said before about the importance of not panicking. And I did think, if I am critical at all of a good introduction from Nick, he did talk about they are very organised, I think he said at one point. And when it came to it, what he went on to say was very organised through social media. And I think we need to unpack that. I think most of us here tonight and in the left generally are of a generation that does not understand social media very well, certainly not very deeply. And I think 6 million hits seems like hell of a lot. But even going back 10, 15, 20 years, where there was the BNP and before them the National Front, these were card-carrying membership organizations, fascist organizations, quite different from what we have today. And I think Ed's point of trying to find ways of detaching, if you like, the street fighters from the undoubted presence amongst them of organised racists and some fascists is really important. And I think we approach that not by going around like the Stand Up for Racism campaign, or to racism rather, not for, is doing currently, which is basically overusing the F word. I think 2 consecutive issues, not this week's, of Socialist Worker have been packed full of talking about fascists here, fascists there, fascists everywhere. And I think we really need to realize that the capitalist states in the advanced capitalist countries have for a long time been honing their own coercive powers. They certainly do not need, they have the legislation in place, the rules in place, the prohibitions in place, the police forces, the paramilitaries, the militaries, the courts, the whole shebang. They do not need fascism in the same way as the German and Italian states, which were weak at the time and did face real upsurges from the working class.
Okay.
How, if I can just make a final point, and then I'll shut up. I think the proof of the pudding will be in whether this recurs, because if a lot of people, as I suspect they were actually there for the hell of it, and because they have been exposed to all this racism from political leaders and the media for so long. If that's what they were, and not organised racists and not organised fascists, then they'll look at Yaxley Lennon swanning himself in a paid-for villa abroad in the sunshine, and they will see their mates serving 2, 3, and 4 years in prison, and they'll think, whoa, hang on. If they're organised fascists and organised racists, that won't deter them. So I think the proof of the pudding will be in what happens next. Personally, I think this will be seen in retrospect as a one-off.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there, John.
Our job is to actually take on and challenge the steady flow of racism from the political parties and from the mainstream media. And I think we should be outside their premises on a consistent basis, challenging them, calling them out on racism.
John, you've right. Over to you, Toby. Toby, you need to set your mute off. Let's see if I can get you to unmute. No. I tell you what, while Toby works out his unmuting, I'll say.
We've done it now, I think. Can you hear us now?
Yes. Go on, Toby.
Okay. The point I really wanted to make was that in the response from Starmer and what I would call Starmerite ministers and undersecretaries or whatever, the people that were I heard on Radio 4, because obviously I wasn't in England at the time, as you all know. That all we heard from Starmer and his lot for a long time was attacking violence, criminality, lawlessness, and thuggery, and so forth. Reluctantly, eventually used the word far right, but he and his mates never actually seemed to use the word fascist. And I think what they really got themselves in, because they'd gone on so much about, okay, the Rwanda scheme is expensive and it's not the right thing, but we want to deport people nonetheless, somewhere or other, and we want to cut immigration, we hate the small boats, all this sort of stuff, that it got to the point, right, where you could criticize the so-called rioters for their thuggery, for their criminality, for their lawlessness, But he and his followers, Starmer I'm talking about, never actually wanted to talk about racism, Islamophobia, anything like that, because they're deeply implicated in it. The whole business of trying to, electorally it proved unsuccessful, but what they were doing right up to the general election, and they still seem to be trying to do it, was to get these so-called red wall voters back. And that seemed to be by adapting entirely to the racism, the xenophobia, the Islamophobia, all this stuff. And therefore, all Starmer could do on his political followers was to talk about the criminality and about the thuggery. I mean, I'm not denying there was a hell of a lot of criminality and thuggery and all the rest of it. But I mean, you then got absurd things like saying people should not join counter-protests, as if the original thing, as if trying to burn down a library or a mosque was a protest. I mean, the Starmer's talking about you mustn't participate in counter-protests. Labour Party members, Labour Party councillors, Labour Party MPs shouldn't participate in counter-protests. And as far as I understood it, okay, from a distance, in the end, it was not the Labour Party that was behind the popular anti-fascist mobilisation on Wednesday, the 7th of August, but in fact, the SWP, whatever else you might say about them, as far as I can work out at a distance, it looked to me, seeing such pictures as I did, that they were the people who organised it. I mean, okay, I know people further to the left would criticise them and say they're being just liberal anti-racist, but I thought it was bloody good that they did it, because the Labour Party leadership did not do it, and they were trying to, I think, expel people. At least one councillor was expelled for taking up an anti-fascist stance. So, I mean, I think there's a difference. Starmerism is worse than Blairism, because Blairism was nominally anti-racist. The official line of the British establishment during the Blair years was anti-racist. And that has gone because of the Brexit thing, which is, the attack on free Romanians in the car. They weren't black, they weren't Muslim, they were just foreign, right? And even the thickest CDL person couldn't imagine that they were black or Muslim.
Okay, I'm gonna have to stop you there. Really interesting point about the difference between Blairism and Starmerism, actually. Really, really interesting point. I'm going to bring in Soraya, and then I'm going to say a few words, and then I'm going to bring Nick in for 5 minutes, Nick, because you're going to get another go at the end, yeah, to pick up some points, yeah? And then I'm going to bring Matthew in. So, Soraya, over to you.
Just some random thoughts, really. I think I disagree with John on, have we got more than one John? No. John Tumman.
Yeah.
About this being a one-off. I think it'd be really dangerous to be complacent about what's happening in society and where we are. I think that capitalism will always resort to whatever measures it considers necessary to protect itself. And we've seen over the past few years a really insidious undermining of basic democratic rights. Now, why is that deemed necessary if everything's fine and capitalism can manage society, manage the working class, because it's got and when I say Labour parties, I mean the parties of the working class in various countries and the trade unions, by and large, in cahoots in supporting capitalism and keeping the working class calm. So why on earth has it been necessary for that insidious undermining of just the most basic, when I say democratic rights, they're all limited, aren't they? We know that as socialist communists. But why is that happening? I think that there is, that capitalism is frightened about what is to come, as in the sort of drastic cuts and more, and therefore is really prepping from the outset, prepping the working class to perhaps not to notice that it's almost a sort of creeping removal of some basic rights, not just rights, but also an expectancy of, in Britain, the free health service, free education, and all of that. So I think it would be very wrong if we thought, well, this is just a few oddballs out on the streets. I don't want to overblow it, but I think that there was a concerted, there are different layers, as Nick has said, and I think that there were those who are, I would class as elements of fascism. And I don't think, I mean, Nick can speak for himself, but I don't think he was saying that everybody who was out in the streets was a fascist. But and I don't use the word fascist lightly, but I think Toby, I don't know. You talked. Maybe it's you talked about criticizing these people for thuggery, lawlessness. We could have a whole discussion about what lawlessness is. Whose law is it, and so on. But what were they pushing? I mean, essentially, they were profoundly racist, but beyond racist ideas. I think I'm not saying the whole of it was, but behind it. That's what it was. And I think that Le Pen and I'll wind up, Le Pen and Meloni and others, different sorts of an approach, some more extreme than others, there's a legitimization in society of very far right becoming, the idea that Meloni could be prime minister, and that Le Pen and the National Assembly could be in power. It's these are forces that are deeply undermining, but in a subtle way. And so I think all of these are real warnings for the future. And it won't be enough to just organise a few anti-democratic, forgive me, a few anti-racist demonstrations to defeat these people. We're going to need to have a revolutionary party, and that seems to be even more pressing.
Okay, thank you. I will. We are 23 minutes into this meeting, so it's been rocking along. I just want to say a few things. I thought lots of really interesting contributions. I think the point that Ed made about gestation was interesting, but also those elements that are kind of on the periphery or could be drawn into the mix or could be brought together to form a genuine kind of far right fascist movement. And somebody who I had as a school friend who found me and became a friend through that tool, Facebook. I've just been watching them over the last few years, and they've gone from being a Brexiteer, and I know there was some on the left who were Brexiteer, so it's not about that, but they've gone from some way to being a Brexiteer to being a vaccine skeptic, to being concerned about the World Economic Forum and powers over which we don't have control over, and the lack of our democracy, to starting to post things along the Toby Robinson's line. Yeah. So I get what Ed is saying, and this is happening. We can, this is just a snapshot, but you can see how people can be drifted over to support far right politics, and the elements are there if they want to lock it together, are there. But I kind of think that my view of this and what's going on in Europe as well is what we're actually seeing is the rise of I agree capitalism doesn't feel threatened by the working class, but I do think we're seeing the rise of an authoritarian nationalism across Europe, which could have in its wings fascists. Yeah, could have in its wings fascists that are gestating at the moment, which I think why Ed's point about gestation is really, really important. And as to the rioters, I mean, well, there's lots of different things going on here, because one, there's some hardline fascist communications going on. We shouldn't be naive about that. But but on the other hand, the Channel 3 thing that Nick mentioned was by a journalistic one person actually in Pakistan who was making advertising money through clickbait. So the Channel 3 messages that were made up about small boats, MI6, Islamic extremists, earned him a lot of money in advertising. He had no idea what the impact would be. So you've got this kind of, on the one hand, you've got this chaotic communications, and information coming from anywhere, which I do think a layer of people are picking up on slowly but times through Facebook and other channels, next to really coherent far-right ideologies. And so I think on the in the demonstrations itself, you had a mixture of those two. You had a rational grouping in those demonstrations who wanted to provoke a response. That's what they wanted to do. Right next to them, you had some pissheads who didn't know what they were doing. And then you had some children next to them, right, who are now being dragged into the criminal justice system like a 12-year-old today. But the core group and the relationship of that organized core group and its relationship to that kind of people who Ed described as being brought into the mix, I think is the really, really crucial one. And that's what we have to keep our eye on. I'm gonna be the only person to keep to 3 minutes tonight, so I'm gonna pass over to Nick. Over to you, Nick.
Wow, it's been an excellent discussion. Really, really good points. I've got 5 minutes now, have I?
Got 5 minutes now, and then I'm gonna allow other people to come back briefly and go back to you.
So I'm going to have to rattle through this. I mean, essentially, I agree with most of the points, including some of the points that John raised that were critical of what I'd said. I'm quite happy to accept some of those points, although I think perhaps John bent the stick too far in the other direction along the lines that Soraya mentioned. Two of the things that I was going to mention in my speech, but didn't have time because I spent too much time on the Civil War, was the international dimension of this, which Matthew started out with. And of course, you know, some people can look and say, oh, well, look what's going on in Germany, what's going on in France, what's going on in America, what's going on in Brazil, what's going on in the Philippines, what's going on in Turkey, India, Argentina. It will never happen here, as if somehow the events in the world don't impinge on what we're experiencing. But clearly this is an international phenomenon, and it's progressing at different rates in different places because of history, because of social traditions, etc. Difference between imperialists, the power of traditional established parties, and so on. I do agree with the idea that fascism is a distinct political formation that is used in certain periods when confronted with revolution by the capitalist class to smash the left and the incipient socialist revolution. But the last time that they handed over to fascists in Germany and Italy, they ended up losing half of Europe to the Stalinist Soviet Union. I think there's certain trepidation in the ruling class about doing so again. However, the other side of it is in the 1920s and the 1930s, you had the experience of the Russian Revolution, the power of Bolshevism as an international force, and it was a pole of attraction, that's a word that's come up several times in this discussion, which drew people in the working class and the middle class towards its banner, and it did threaten the status quo. We don't see that at the moment. The left everywhere is nowhere. I mean, that's the problem. So when we're looking at events in Middlesbrough, for example, and I think it was in Middlesbrough where somebody was recently arrested. I don't know if you saw the video. There were racist patrols set up at crossroads where cars were stopped and people were asked or looked at, are you black, are you white, are you Asian? Yeah. And it was a form of, if you like, Israeli checkpoint in Gaza or the West Bank, as a form of apartheid. And the idea that this can happen on the streets in the UK actually is, I think, deeply shocking. If people are caught up in that and go along with it, then again, I'm happy to accept the differentiation. Of course, not everybody is of the same mindset, but where in Middlesbrough or Stockton or Sunderland are the groups that Steve Forrest mentioned of the young socialists? So where is the organized left? Where is the Marxist left who are going to young unemployed people, people with no the NEETs, people with no education or training? Where are the people that don't have a job? Where are the people that are in low-paid minimum wage jobs? Going to them and arguing for a different form of society and trying to draw that layer, not away from the lure of racism, of blaming the other, of blaming the Muslim. It used to be anti-Semitism in the main that fascism latched onto, but what we've seen is a change in the last 20 years, where now, certainly in Europe and America, it's more Islamophobia. It shows that fascism doesn't care what device it uses to divide the working class. It will pick up on anything. And fascism is itself is a class phenomenon. It's not an identity. You can have Hindu fascists, you can have Asian fascists, you can have black fascists. Fascism is a class issue rather than an identity. But the key point, if I've got maybe 1 minute left to make, is that however we assess the processes that the events that we've seen, neither exaggerating or underestimating, and that needs a lot of discussion, and we need a lot more detail and a lot more information and a lot more consideration. But the lesson that we've got to take from it is that we, the people in this room and our friends and our comrades, have seriously got to begin discussing and bringing about a new party, however small and weak that is in the first instance. Kate mentioned the RCP, and I've got a lot of, I give a lot of credit to what they've been doing, but I've also got a lot of criticism about how they organize. We need a democratic mass socialist communist party.
I'll give you a few more minutes at the end as well, Nick.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Matthew. Oh no, hang on, sorry. I'm going to go to Minnie because Minnie hasn't spoken. I'm really sorry. Over to you, Minnie.
Yeah, I take it everyone's points on board. Really interesting and relevant points being made. But I think that the amount of people who were involved in these so-called riots, protests, the criminal records, we are where we are. Capitalism is a mess. The criminal records they had in Liverpool locally that were involved in burning a library, they had records for drug dealing, violent behavior, burglary, you name it. They had strings and strings of previous. And I think there's a lot of violence in society. There's been racism in this society, in this country, bubbling up for years. I can remember one job I had where a woman was living in a social housing. She was black, she had an autistic son, and she was being hounded. And it's, if you open the disgusting pages of any local newspaper like the Liverpool Echo, it's disgusting. The crime and the violence, it broke out into mainstream areas. It got on telly and embarrassed the politicians. Well, they've caused this. There's a hell of a lot of anger. People can't assert themselves, and they're dying to punch down because they're being whipped up. But there are shopping precincts where people run riot, and old people are frightened to go out shopping. It's happening all over the country, and it just so happened to get really big and get in the news. But it really, people are oppressed by capitalism, and it's so violent. I went up to Tesco the other day, and there was and it was right near where a great crowd of people came out in Liverpool to get rid, ward off the far right. It was fantastic to see so many people, and it was like being in a war zone. There were helicopters overhead. But right by there was a guy threatening a woman with a knife, and it was nothing to do with racism. They were both white, and that was going on. You just have to slightly offend someone, and they want to kill you. So what's going on? It's about power, and it's about how people are living their lives through commodities, through lack of power. It's sick, and it burst out. Oh, it embarrassed the politicians. Well, it's everywhere anyway, and it's sick.
Thank you very much. Matthew, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes if you don't mind.
Okay, right. I should go through really quickly. I do agree with what Minnie's just said. I mean, obviously, it's right. Capitalism is deeply violent society, and of course, the fact that Starmer's first thing is to maintain the Tories' benefit cuts and add his own in an effort to freeze pensioners this winter. He's adding so. I think the other thing, of course, is to say, well, no matter what the government says, actually, the Home Office is racist and always has been. It always has been. And the operation of the state machine itself is racist. I mean, how could it be else? I think that the as I say, the rise of the Reform Party is a party which is openly racist and doesn't make anything about it is important, and that actually is part of the trigger. And I think the other thing to say really is this political crisis for the ruling class. I mean, if you go back, I mean, what we're looking at now is actually bourgeois democracy itself is in crisis because it's failing to deliver. I mean, if you go back to the 20s in Glasgow, over 80% of people vote because they think, nearly 90% of people vote because they think it makes a difference, and they elect, you know, left-wing MPs and so on. Now, less than 50% of people in this city vote. You know, that's how it works because they can see the clowns on offer and they don't like any of them. You know, none of them are offering anything. And we can see this is even going to be even worse, you know, after the Starmer's crew. And the thing is, of course, they don't have a social base either. So the problem being for the ruling class is how does it actually create something, some means of control? I mean, the Tory party has been shattered. I mean, that's the point of what's happened now, is the large chunk of the Tory vote and its base to say, we're not voting for you bastards anymore. You know, some of them went off to vote for reform. The problem they've got, of course, is they've shoved in the Labour Party on the basis of this of a marginal vote, and the process will happen to again. You see, the problem being, of course, is they need something they can rest on politically, and also, of course, under the conditions in which they're actually imperialism is moving towards war. Far more in terms of war. You know, you have Ukraine war, you have the war in Gaza, and so on. You know, it will then need some means of repression. And we can see this now. I mean, obviously, what we're seeing now is journalists being locked up, you know, under Blair's terrorism acts. You know, I mean,
Okay, Matthew.
people being surrounded by cops and hauled off. And
Okay,
that,
Matthew.
of course, can be applied to everybody else. Yeah, okay, thanks.
I'm going to stop you there. Thank you very much. John, I'm going to have to be very strict because we're incredibly tight on time. You got 2 minutes, okay?
Yes, just finishing off of what I was saying. People were saying that whether it's a one-off or not. As I say, Tommy Robinson will be coming back, and they will arrest him, and we'll see whether something there could be a call for a big demonstration on the right if he's arrested. Something along those lines. We don't know as to where that would go. I suppose the other thing I kind of wanted to say was that the issue around about the development of the move to the right in European countries and here and United States and so on and so on. The whole issue is all around immigration. It's all around immigration. We've had wars in Afghanistan, Libya, and God knows where else. We've created millions of people that are in dire conditions, dying from day to day, wanting to have some kind of life. This is huge. I mean, the issue here is that that's all. It's not about capitalism actually declining as such. It's about how do they deal with what's going on in the world, the immigration, with climate change. There you get a load, there's a lot of refugees coming over on that. I mean, this is something which isn't, I mean, in the 30s, we didn't have this. We didn't have, tens of millions of refugees, asylum seekers. It wasn't, so for me, the fact of the European Union in the first place, that fell apart in 2008.
John,
that fell apart in 2008. So since then, capitalism as such has brought in austerity all over the world in one form or another. And then, what they've done is to say, let's blame somebody.
Yeah, I'm going to stop you there, John.
And that's it.
Okay, thank you. Eloquently put, I think. Nick, Wrack, you're going to get 5 minutes, Nick, so you have to stick to it because we're really short on time. Well, 4, in fact, we're going to overrun.
Put a finger up when I've got 1 minute and I will
will.
Finish in time. So there's far too many excellent points for me to come back on. So I'm just going to make a few pointed comments, if I may. I do not think that this is the last of it. I don't think that this is a one-off. Notwithstanding the heavy sentences that have been meted out. There was an article in the Independent just at the weekend about Tommy Robinson's plans to try to bring together members of different faiths in a coalition against Islam. I'm pretty certain that he, with the finance that he's got, the report said that he's spending £20,000 a month on organising. I think there is quite a lot of organising going in, and I don't think this is the end of it that we're going to see. So we as the left have to get organised, and I think we have to work with each other in different groups, and we do have to turn out on the streets, and we do have to protect vulnerable communities, minorities, people of colour, mosques, community centres. We do have to organise, and that means proper planning in localities, and it means not one group trying to steal the pitch and exclude everybody else. It needs to be collaborative and democratic. But I come back to the point that I made in my last contribution. The battle against fascism is not primarily physical, in my opinion. The battle against fascism is political. It's about presenting a political alternative to this system, which has all of the problems and issues that people have talked about. It's a society that's built on racism. It's a society that's built on violence. It's a society that excludes people, that tramples on them, that abandons them and treats them like they're worthless. We, on the other hand, stand for all members of the working class, and that's not just in Britain. We stand and fight on behalf of all people all over the world. And that's another important point. I think John's points there on the question of immigration are very important. And actually, immigration, I don't think we can, minimize it. It can be a difficult issue. Because our answer to the question of immigration essentially is, we won't blame immigrants. It's the world that we have to change. If you want to stop immigration, you have to stop wars, you have to stop persecution, and that means stopping capitalism. We have to fight to overthrow capitalism. But you do not do it. I'll leave people to go away and research this point. In Thuringia and Saxony, where the AFD rather, came first and second, getting 30% and 38% of the vote. The new party, the BSW, which is the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, has come out of the left, but it's now becoming more popular because it's adopting anti-immigration policies. So it's appealing to voters of the AFD by mixing together left-wing rhetoric about state ownership and so on with anti-immigration. That is not the way to defeat the fascists. We have to take an internationalist stance. We have to put forward a program for confronting and changing and defeating capitalism.
Thank you very much. 4 minutes bang on. Brilliant. All right. Brilliant discussion. Actually, a really, really interesting discussion. So thanks for everybody who came and who made a contribution, and thanks for Nick with an extended contribution, I thought, which was really, really interesting. Now, Nick's going to be putting an article to be on the TAS website. We're going to have an article up there. And what we want you to do is come and debate on the website and come and make your points that you've made tonight. Let's have a rolling discussion on the website, on the Talking About Socialism website. To pick up we are going to be looking at the question of having a session on policing and what its role is, actually. And that was suggested by Kate, and we think that's a really important issue. And we have the following meetings coming up over the next we've got a series of meetings lined up. You'll have seen it in the bulletin. On the 16th of September, we have a meeting on Bangladesh, how a mass movement toppled the government and what does it mean? And Ed will be presenting on that. on the 30th of September, I've got the delightful task of looking back at the first 100 days of Keir Starmer's Labour government. And on the 14th of October, we will be looking at Israel-Palestine, a year after the Hamas action and the Israeli invasion of Gaza and now the West Bank. So there's going to be a lot of interesting discussion. So we want to see you all there. And when you get the bulletin, it'd be great if you could pass it on to others to say, actually, these are some interesting discussions we're having here. Pass it on to people you know, get them to sign up and get them to come and join in. Okay. Thanks very much. Thanks, Nick. That was great. And thanks to everybody for their contributions. And see you next time.